So my name is Monika. I am actually originally from Hungary, but migrated to Denmark and started to work at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies about 3 years ago. I'm an advisor there and also work a lot with courses and organizing our courses that Roberto was also part of a few months ago. And what we'll do today is talking about megatrends, talking about foresight, as a tool to actually understand how the future might look like, and future studies as a field, which I will of course introduce you to a little bit more, and of course all that, how they are connected and how they could relate to tourism and traveling in the future. But before we start to talk about the topic itself, let me just say a few words about who we are. We have a really long name, so we like to just shorten it as CIFS, much easier to work with. And we are actually a non-profit organization. We were funded in 1969, so it's a quite old organization, but we went through a lot of transformation ourselves as well in how we work with the future. We used to do more forecasting, for example. Now we are turning into foresight, and I will explain what's the difference in a second. We have about 30 to 35 employees, so we are not a huge organization. But we do have quite diverse backgrounds. So I have colleagues with sociology background, I have colleagues with architecture background, there's an astrophysicist, I'm from economic background. So we really try to challenge each other every day on how the future how the future could look like and how our world is actually changing. And our goal is basically to help people and organizations imagine, work with, and also based on that shape our future. And we do that with many different companies across the whole sector. So these are some of our partners and companies that we have worked with. And you can see we have IKEA, a furniture company, we have UNDP, the development organization, also Toyota, which also means that we are not necessarily specialized or experts in any of these industries specifically. So what we try to do is always creating this collaborative environment where we get their insights about their industry and about their struggles, and we try to match it with what is going on in the world and how the future could look like, and we try to find this sweet spot on what they can actually do in order to prepare for this future. And despite being only 35 people, we do a lot of different things. So we have our advisory services, first and foremost, where we work mostly with large international organizations or companies. But that also, of course, comes back into to fuel all the other activities that we do. We have a publication called Farsight. We also have some online articles I'll share with you later that you can maybe visit if you would like to. This Farsight comes out every 4 times a year, so it's always on a different topic related to the future. I think the next one is going to be who is responsible actually for the future. I'm not sure if I was allowed to say that, but now I say it. We do talks like this, and we also do the courses, which goes more into depth with methodology. So what are the concrete tools and ways of thinking that you can apply in order to see how the future might look like? And final initiatives, more non-profit initiatives that we try to do targeted to certain areas. For example, we have this Teach the Future movement where we try to implement foresight as part of school curriculums. And we just actually created a cartoon that is a really nice way of engaging children as well to think about the future. So, without further ado, I'm going to jump into what future studies is and strategic foresight. I'll give you a little bit of a background on it, and then we're going to talk about a little bit about megatrends more concretely. But I would like to start the whole thing with a personal reflection, actually, in relation to the multiple phases of traveling. And I love traveling. I'm guilty. I really like it, and I think it contributes a lot to mental well-being, also about really understanding different cultures and different perspectives. And then in exchange, it also helps me in my work. So I travel whenever I can. And one of the bit longer travels I took was actually to Indonesia last year. And this trip particularly showed me some of the upsides and downsides of tourism as well. Let's just say that. So This is actually a picture I took specifically from a boat that I took. Don't imagine a yacht, it's a backpacking boat. So we were 20 people sleeping beside each other on mattresses, having one shower on the middle of the deck that we shared, and some minimal facilities on the side, but we were fine. We had everything we needed. Took approximately 2 days to get used to the whole thing, because it's not something most of the participants or travelers were used to. But then it became a really nice experience, and by this point, at the end of the second day, that was the first time when I could actually let go of everything that is going on in the world. I didn't really have internet. You would be surprised, there is actually internet sometimes on the middle of the sea, but there wasn't actually a lot of internet, there wasn't connection, so the only reason why I took my phone is maybe to take a few pictures. Apart from that, you could really detach from society. So if anyone wanted to call me from work, they couldn't. If something happened to me, no one would know it. And by this time, I could really embrace this. And this became one of the favorite moments of all my travels because of that. Because I had the time to actually detach a little bit and try to just focus in the moment. Then, of course, we visited a lot of beautiful places. This is one of my favorite islands. It's around the Komodo Islands in the eastern part of Indonesia. We also saw Komodo dragons, which only exist in the whole world in those islands, right? And they are doing a lot of nice conservational work, and they really try to make sure that the species survives. But of course, on the other hand, in all this beautiful scenery, as you all know, there is also pollution. And some of these islands that we visited, they were actually either uninhabited or there were maybe 1 or 2 tribes living on them. And this is why this was super surprising. Because you didn't see anyone around, you didn't see even ships around, you didn't actively see where this trash is coming from, but it was there. Same with, of course, the bleached corals and the beautiful sea and blue sea, but you can see that all corals are brown or white. And that's a very different experience, knowing that it happens and actively being there and understanding how connected our whole world is. And of course, eventually we got to Bali as well, which was a very, very difficult experience to come back from that moment into civilization and see a lot of people who are doing their nails while I didn't look into the mirror for 4 days. And then we wanted to take this tour up to the mountain in a sunrise tour, because they said that would be really nice, and I was a bit surprised why we go at 2 a.m. I thought that was a bit too early. And then I realized why, because there was approximately 30,000 people behind me on the volcano. And that's not the whole picture, of course. Bear in mind, this is an active volcano. So if that had erupted, I couldn't have gone anywhere, because I had to take 1 step in every 5 minutes in order to come up to the mountain. So that was officially the first time when I could really, really experience how over-tourism looks like in reality. And going from that place to this one, that was a huge change in 4 days. And of course, you probably know about many of these changes in the world, but it actually points to a lot of global developments that we no longer really can ignore. And it also shows that the way in which we develop in our countries, the way in which we measure growth, and the way in which tourism works as well, is not really sustainable the way how we used to do it. And therefore, something has to be changed. But how can we actually think about future studies, or how does future studies come into the whole picture? So I would say it's somewhere between, of course, science, data, and knowledge about how the past used to look like and how it, of course, led us to the present. But also about creativity and imagining how the future could look like based on all the knowledge that we already have. And somewhere in the intersection of those, that's where future studies come alive. This also means, that we do not only imagine one future, we don't try to predict the future. It's very difficult. Most predictions actually go wrong. So we always try to work with multiple futures and alternative futures and try to understand what are those plausible future states that we can imagine based on today's knowledge. And how can we actually work with it? How can we prepare for it and be more robust? We also don't think it's predetermined, the future, but it is the consequences of our choices, even though sometimes we feel like individuals, we don't have as much impact on how the world actually works. But it is indeed useful to actually understand how this is all connected. So thinking in systems rather than linear way, because we also often overestimate the impact in the short run and underestimate the impact in the long run. So for example, taking sustainability as an example, it's a very slow process. It's difficult for us to really understand from day to day how bad it gets, but if there is a flipping point, then we fall into this fallacy here, that we underestimated the impact in the long run. And then it flips and there is maybe no going back, but it's at least getting really difficult to solve the issue. But just to get you a little bit thinking about the future as well, we really like to use this picture, and I think Roberto has already seen it, many of these slides actually. But this is a picture from an American lifestyle magazine in 1950 that tried to imagine how the year 2000 would look like. And let's just extend it to the present. So if you look at this picture, what are those things that you think they actually got right?
The FaceTime or whatever.
Yeah, the FaceTime, the tablet. Yeah, very good. Anything else?
Open space living.
Yes, yes. So kind of the kitchen
rooms.
connected to the living room, this American style modern kitchen. Yes.
It shows an interface of the big screen.
Yes, there is a flat screen over there. Yeah, and there is a big face in there as well.
The guy traveling on the back.
Yes, and now,
Traveling.
yeah, that's a bit out there. So I'm not sure people get home with helicopters and come down from the roof, but helicopters exist at least. Yes. Anything else that they maybe got right?
The salads and
Mm-hmm. So a
more greens.
healthy way of
the
living.
American.
Yes, exactly. Now, if we shift to what are the things that they got maybe wrong, or it's a bit weird.
Well, the laundry service looks a bit over-optimistic.
That is true. That's actually a washing machine that washes, dries, and folds your clothes. I wish that existed. So maybe we are not that far out there, but I don't give up hope. I think it's possible. Anything else?
The smoke, the guy is smoking inside.
Exactly. So the grandpa is sitting beside the children and smoking inside the house.
Having women taking care of home only.
Exactly. So the gender roles, right?
Yes.
Yes. And then you mentioned also the salad, right? Is that how the American population looks like today? No. Their diets also are really different, right? And there is a huge problem with obesity in many countries, for sure. Anything else?
The helicopter you mentioned.
Yeah, that is still weird. Yeah, I agree. Yes. But basically what we are trying to get to here is that when it comes to technological changes, there is actually, they got a lot of things right. And it was quite easy. Even architecture, they could kind of imagine how the future might look like. But when it comes to societal change and cultural change, that's going very slowly, and it's very difficult to actually predict how it might look like in the future. So we have to always keep in mind this interconnectedness between technology and society. So what technological tools we actually need and gets developed based on that, but also how that affects us backwards and how that changes the way in which we live. And of course, there are also other changes that affect how our society is changing. Very good. Just to show you a few more fun things, this is an advertising from 1962 from Humble Oil, which says each day Humble supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. Yes. Today, I wouldn't say it would be that popular as it is today. But of course, this was before the time we even knew climate change was an issue. Same with this one. So changing norms over time, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. So we actually could promote cigarettes with doctors, which is a really odd thought now, but they only figured it out in, I think, 1970s or so that it is actually cancerous. So now it's crazy, but at that time, based on the knowledge they had, it was unimaginable that you wouldn't smoke cigarettes, or even doctors wouldn't do it. But something else that actually is getting more and more relevant, for example, because that can also be the case. I don't know if you have read the book 1984. Yeah, a lot of people are nodding. Yeah, I actually recently finished it again. I read it in pieces, and I get surprised every time how more and more relevant it gets as a book. So for those that haven't read it, this book was written in 1948 about the year 1984, so about the future, and it describes a world that is really split. So we have three main superpowers in the world, and they all fight against each other, but they're quite isolated. And this hatred towards each other unites them, unites the society as well. They also surveil everyone. There's mass surveillance. They listen to what we say. They look at what we do, which is pretty much what we have today in different ways. And they can also control, of course, what is history. So they would actively get rid of information about the past that they don't think is we should think about. And that would influence the way in which, of course, we think how the world works. And one of my favorite quotes from there is, "Who controls the past controls the future," because that's what we actually base our, of course, assumptions from on how the future look like. But who controls the present controls the past. So if someone can control the knowledge that we have today, that can alter, of course, how we also view the past and how we view the future. And that is a really dangerous thing. And something that we talked about internally, at least in the company a few days ago, how AI comes into all this. Because in the book, it's not a government, but it's an entity, more or less, that controls all the knowledge that is out there. But today, it's a bit out of control. I wouldn't say that anyone has really clear idea on how data generation and the use of data actually works. And over time, if it continues, it might be almost impossible to know what is true and what is not. It's just food for thought, and it's not as gloomy. We might actually turn it around. But it's just an interesting way to think about how an 80-year-old book could actually be more relevant today than ever. But how can you actually think about the future? So if you look at on the left-hand side, that's where we are today. And the more we go into the future, the more high, the wider the scope gets on how the future could look like. And the more difficult it is to predict as well. So if you only go with predictions and you extrapolate every trend that we can see today, you will be in the probable area. So this very small circle here, which are based on current trends, what will happen. Then if we go a little bit further out, and that's where we usually work in, we get into the plausible future. So based on today's knowledge, what could happen? What are the alternative ways in which the future could develop? And then if you go even more out, then you get into the possible realm, which is based on future knowledge. How will the future look like? But because we don't have that knowledge, it's a little bit difficult to make, how to say, realistic inferences about those things. So these would be really speculative scenarios, for example, or wild cards. So events that you don't really imagine that they could happen, but it's a nice what-if scenario. And then something to keep in mind is the preferable future. So the future we actually want to happen, because it might be actually outside of the scope what is plausible. So it's also testing your own biases when you work with the future. And we often, because we try to, of course, challenge companies and individuals to think a little bit longer ahead to combat this short-termism. With companies, we often use like a time frame of 10, 15 years. It's not set in stone, but that is kind of a time frame where you are still rooted in the present enough that you can imagine what could happen, but it's not that much out there that you have no idea what is possible. So always go a little bit further than you usually think ahead. And of course, there are also different approaches on how to work with the future. So many people use predictions and forecasting that we also talk about, perhaps what-if projections. And that is a good way to start out. What are the predictions out there? What do people say? What are the trends that we can see? But then where we work usually is the explorative phase. So instead of asking what will happen, like in the predictive approach, we rather ask this what could happen question. And we try to look at all the external factors that are usually outside of our control. And we look at, based on that, of course, what could happen. Or sometimes strategic options or the consequences of strategic choices could also be a way to look at it. But we usually use the first option. And then finally, normative approach is the more vision-based approach. So what is what we actually want the future to look like and what can we do in order to get there? And these approaches are not mutually exclusive. So often, I would say it's a nice way to start with predictions, see what's out there, then be explorative and see, as of course unbiased as you can, what could actually happen, and then maybe have a normative approach on would you like the future to look like, but based on the knowledge already that what is plausible, right? So you are not falling into the bias what I showed before, that you're outside of the plausible realm. Good. And of course, when we think about these trends, they are not linear. So they are affected by many different changes in society. There are some drivers that push some trends forward, and there are also some blockers. So going back to the sustainability example, a driver could be that we have more and more regulations in place. There's more and more environmental disasters that could push this sustainability agenda forward. But on the other hand, there are also some blockers, and that could be convenience, for example. Is convenience more important than sustainability, for example, and consumer choices? And if convenience is more important and that convenient solution is not sustainable, are you still making that choice? So these things, of course, shape how megatrends, but also just regular trends get shaped over time. And to show you an example of what non-linearity looks like, have you ever seen this bridge before? It's also just a bridge. I wouldn't recognize it either, but it is in Honduras. It's a Choluteca bridge, if I pronounce it properly. I think this is actually the first bridge, and there was another bridge built after this because this got collapsed. They have a lot of hurricanes, so a lot of environmental disasters in general. And then they asked some engineers to build a bridge that will never get destroyed, no matter what happens, because they had so many hurricanes, right? So they collected all the best engineers in the world, and in 1998, they finished the construction of the second bridge, and they did a great job because afterwards, Hurricane Mitch actually hit Honduras right after the constructions ended, and the bridge stayed. So they reached their goal. It didn't go anywhere. The only issue was that the landscape changed around it. So now we have a bridge that goes nowhere because the river is actually more towards the right. So it is also a question about, do you build to last or do you build to adapt? And in order to build to adapt, you have to be comfortable with uncertainty sometimes. And you have to be open to that everything can change from one minute to another and you need to go with it. Yeah. But when we come to uncertainties, of course, there are some examples maybe I can give to you, but I'm sure you can come up with many more. What are those societal major uncertainties we can think about? It could be, for example, the globalization question. So after COVID-19, a lot of people thought maybe there would be more international cooperation amongst countries and different entities. But it seems to be like maybe it's not entirely the way we are going to. Then a lot of people started to talk about, is there going to be maybe a two-block world, maybe US versus China with trade wars going on, Eastern Bloc versus Western Bloc. But now also people talk about maybe there's going to be regionalization, perhaps nearshoring, or if not regionalization, but maybe you will have a selected group of countries across the world that actually support your ideals and your visions, and maybe they are the ones that you want to work together with. But there's definitely uncertainty around how our world is going to look like compared to the last decades that we got used to. Then we have the question of artificial intelligence, of course, and I think something that's an interesting uncertainty is to what degree it's going to have an impact on our lives. So are we going to have a tech-enabled future where technology helps us to make decisions, so it gives us information and we make the decision ourselves? Or is it going to be tech-led, perhaps? So maybe it collects the data, analyzes it, and it already orders the groceries for you. You don't have to do it. But of course, that also requires that you give up your decision-making power and you give up your information. And not everyone is comfortable with that. So there is an uncertainty there as well. Retail, are we missing walking into stores? Do we like to physically go? And sometimes some people do. Or are we going to go online forever, or perhaps end up somewhere in between in a weird hybrid world, which kind of we have today? And finally, sustainability. Is conscious consumerism going to be the main driver, or are we perhaps leaning more towards convenience, even though we still care about the environment, we still care about health. So it's going to be the main driver of our consumer behavior. And apart from these uncertainties, we also have some shocks happening, of course, in society. So Black Swan, maybe you have heard about before. Those are events that happen out of nowhere. No one knows that they are coming, and they really disrupt society. So one of the examples we usually use is 9/11, because people didn't see that coming to the scale it happened. But then we also have something like Black Elephant. Those are actually things that people saw coming. Maybe they didn't know when it would happen and how it would happen, but they have knowledge about it. And that could be, for example, sustainability as well, again, to going back to the same example, because we know that it is going to have an impact, but it still gets to some degree ignored. Or COVID-19, which was also kind of predicted that it would happen, but countries weren't prepared for it because maybe there were different priorities that were more urgent, right? And then finally, black jellyfish. Those are things that we think we know, but they turn out to be more complicated than we think they are. For example, artificial intelligence, right? You're just going into the loop of ChatGPT and everything else, and everything is happening so fast, it's very difficult to actually know how it's going to change. This is actually a slide I stole from my boss, but I'm sure she would be okay with it. But it's a great example of how in each scenario, so in each future scenario, you can have winners and losers. And that's always something to keep in mind. There is not one future that is good for everyone. There is always going to be someone that gains from it and someone who loses from it. Regardless if we talk about people, or we talk about nature, or we talk about animals, etc. So what we have here is a wedding planning. So one uncertainty, is there going to be a good weather or a bad weather, right? Umbrellas or sunscreen. The other axis is, can granny join? So is there going to be, for example, a pandemic? Is there going to be a virus or not? And of course, the best scenario, sunny weather, no COVID, everyone can come, everyone is happy, right? And then the worst is obviously the Zoom wedding, where we have COVID and it's also bad weather, so you can't even go into the balcony. But then the big question is, who has the most money for the honeymoon, right? So even though this seems to be the worst scenario of all, there is always something positive to it. And that's something to keep in mind. Everything has two sides, right? And because of that, despite all this uncertainty and complexity we have in the world, you can run away from it, and a lot of people do. A lot of people like to use numbers and predictions because it gives them some security about how the future will look like. But instead, what we try to do, at least, is trying to look at uncertainty not as a bug, but rather as a feature that I try to understand. Because the more you understand, the further you get. So one quote that really summarizes it, maybe I've heard it before, from Rumsfeld, is there are things that we know, those are easy. Then there are things that we know, they're known unknowns, that we know that there are some things we don't know. So we are aware of it, what we don't know, basically. But then there are things that we don't know that we don't know. And what we try to do in Foresight, and what Foresight can do for you, it's not that you will know everything at the end of the session or at the end of today, but you will at least get closer to understanding what are the main uncertainties that you should actually pay attention to, and that can make you also more agile. But it all starts with a mindset. It's a lot about mindset. It's a lot about psychology, actually, and openness. And knowing your biases is a good starting point. There are 180 biases, so I'm not going to go through all that, but just a few that we usually handpick is change is bad for business, so the status quo bias. People just like to go with what they already know. They don't like to change. Then there is also the confirmation bias, which I'm sure we have all fallen into before. It's when in doubt, go with what you know, or search directly for information that confirms your own beliefs already. And I did this a lot in my own studies. Back when I was studying in economics, we love to use numbers, and everything that has data, it basically only matters if you have data on it. So I actively looked for information that I believed was true, and then I just confirmed it for myself that I'm really smart. And I didn't try to look for the opposite information, right? Then there's the optimism bias. So the idea is so good, it couldn't possibly fail. I heard from my colleague who is an architect that architects sometimes fall into this trap, for example. How convenient that we all think the same, the groupthink fallacy. So when you surround yourself with people from the same background who looks the same, they will conveniently think the same as you. And finally, the expert problem bias. So when something is outside of the frameworks of how you were thought to think, you just choose to ignore it. So it's kind of limiting your imagination and how you think about the world. And just a funny example on how you can get your own futures wrong as well. Margaret Thatcher, for example, said that it will be years, not in my time, before a woman will become prime minister. And then approximately 5 to 7 years later, she actually became the first one, right? So sometimes it can actually happen positive things that you didn't expect because of how you think about the world. And just to give you a minute to reflect, if you would like to share, but if not, that's also fine. But take a moment on if you can remember a situation where you fell for your own bias and how did it affect you? Does anyone have maybe something to share? We are willing to share? It is a tough one. It's also it plays onto the insecurities of the peoples. But one of the examples, of course, what I said as well is the confirmation bias, and probably everyone has tried that one before, right? And how it affected me, definitely. I thought that I was the smartest person in the world until, of course, I started to be a bit more open. And future studies definitely helped me. I was very critical about the field itself, but then it helped me really understand from different lenses how different people view the world. And there's a checklist that you can always go through when it comes to this. You can see, for example, futures as plural, so being open to the idea that there are multiple futures out there. Prompt what if questions. Say yes and, so instead of going no but, so disagreeing with someone and just going against entirely, first try to understand what they mean and maybe build onto that, or try to show a different perspective. So you build upon each other's ideas, because that's how you can really understand what, for example, solutions, products, services could actually be useful for everyone in the future. And find the right questions to ask, of course. Sometimes it's more important than finding the right answers. And seeking diversity always helps. And even though seeking diversity is just the first step, because fosters psychological safety is just as important. So even if you invite young people, for example, and ask them, how do you imagine that the future of tourism could look like? And what would you like? What are your hopes and fears, for example, for the future? Why do you like traveling? Or what are you afraid of in terms of traveling? If they are in an environment where they are not comfortable with actually speaking up, then they will not do so, or they will alter their answers depending on who is in the room. So that's also something to keep in mind. And that will lead us, of course, to reperception as a concept, which is the awakening to the possibility of the future being different from the past or how one expects it to be. So looking at the same problem from different perspectives, and when I say different perspectives, if it comes to tourism, it's not just people, as we mentioned, right? So looking at the perspective of the traveler, the perspective of the local person, the perspective of the company that provides the services, and also the perspective of the environment, for example, and trying to understand what is positive and negative from all perspectives. And why this is important, because at least according to the World Economic Forum, 75% of the organizations are not prepared for the pace of change in and around their industry. So this is why maybe foresight could be a way for you as well. But where to look for change, just to get a little bit more concrete. So we always like to start out with megatrends. Megatrends is a good starting point. They are large societal changes that have a time frame of 10 to 15 years approximately, or a lifetime. And they are trends that we are kind of actually certain about, that they are pushing our society forward. So one of the only certainties that we have, more or less. But of course, that is not to say that there are many things below these topics that might be uncertain or that maybe contradict with each other. So for example, if we look at globalization, we already talked about it, that we call it globalization, but there's a lot of geopolitical power shifts going on, and we don't really know how that's going to look like. We also have an aging world that is not going to change from one second to another, that we always need to take into account when we think about the future. Individualization and empowerment as a value, becoming stronger and stronger, but that also means that people maybe have different ideas on how they would like the future to look like. And that can also lead, in some cases, maybe to polarization. Focus on health, of course, and finally, those things are also very important up there. Of course, technological development, but economic growth and concentration of wealth. Because our economic system are still based on numbers, like GDP, that is only taking into account consumption. And when it comes to the tourism industry, it might be then the tourism arrivals in a country, for example, and the contribution to the GDP, of course. And those don't take into account well-being, those don't take into account the nature's state, doesn't take into account all the other benefits, and also, of course, the damages that, for example, tourism can have on the future. So our whole system, of course, is still reliant on that. And unfortunately, that's not something that would change either from one second to another. So try to keep these in mind in the next few minutes, but also keep in mind that they're all interconnected, and sometimes they go parallel to each other. Sometimes they have some frictions or create some frictions, which I will also talk about in a second. And one other thing we often like to use is the pastel model, if you have seen that before. So considering different areas when you think about the future and making sure you cover everything when you try to describe both the contextual environment, so the macro level changes, societal changes, but also the operational environment, so the industry level changes. And these are different topics like political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal changes. But how could actually all this relate to tourism? We arrived. It was only 45 minutes. To start out with COVID-19, during COVID-19 there was a lot of scare that tourism is done. We are not going to travel anymore. Perhaps also partly because of course, there's a disease, and that came with a lot of regulations around the restrictions also on where you can travel, where not. A lot of people left the industry. People had less money to spend because many of them lost their jobs, unfortunately. But also it showed us how well the environment is doing when you are not traveling and flying around in the world. But that's not really what happens. People were even hopeful that because of the technological advancements and AI tools and VR glasses, maybe we could just immerse ourselves into traveling to other places without physically doing so. But that's not really how technology is contributing today. So we might have personal AI assistants making or organizing our trips, booking maybe our hotels over time. Perhaps you would use glasses that will have a virtual layer on maybe touristic sites, and that gives you some information. But at least to the degree we thought it would be implemented, it didn't really turn out that way, because I think with the 2023 numbers as well, we basically recovered. At least the way in which we measure how tourism is doing, right? So based on arrival numbers, and we are continue flying like there's no tomorrow. As a matter of fact, 6th of July 2023, maybe you know, was the busiest day in the history of aviation. So there were 134,386 planes in the air at the same time, which is crazy. Of course, you can always see the zones where maybe there's not that much flight going on. But this was actually right after the pandemic, so that's very interesting. Yeah. But yes, but it's not to say that the way in which we travel is entirely the same. Maybe there are some alterations in the background. So that's just about how much we travel, but why we travel, how we travel, that might still be different. And a quote that I wrote for you is from someone called Wes Espinosa. I interviewed him from an article about the future of tourism, actually, and the impact of tourism. And he had a really good quote about how we market tourism. So how you market the experience is incredibly important. If you are just showing people a picture of a beach and a margarita, then people are more likely to arrive with this expectation. And this is, I guess, the historic way of actually advertising tourism in the beginning of the times, I guess. So this is our very first idea, maybe, how tourism looks like. But of course, there are two different problems with this. One of them is that's not the whole truth. So going back to my personal experience, I was on beautiful beaches and I didn't drink margarita, but I could have. But there was still a lot of environmental damage around. I could still see a lot of overpopulation. I could still see how much local people work in the industry and that sometimes maybe the work conditions were not as good, perhaps. So it doesn't show the whole picture. And if you did show the whole picture, maybe it would also alter the way in which you want to travel, because then you know the real impact that you actually leave behind. Of course, not stopping altogether traveling, but at least altering. And the other thing is also that our values are changing. So based on all the shocks, COVID-19, the cost of living crisis, the way in which we live our lives and what is important to us might change as well. So this might not reflect anymore how we want to travel in the future. And of course, this is impacted by many of the risks and many of the shocks that is in our today's world. This is the World Economic Forum's kind of analysis from last year on how people rank different types of shocks and external changes to have a really big impact on our lives. So if you look at 2 years ahead only, it's actually quite diverse across different areas. Those are the colors on the left. So cost of living crisis is the highest issue that people saw. Then, of course, some environmental issues as well, like natural disasters, failure to mitigate climate change, but also the geo-economic confrontation, and unfortunately the wars that we experience, and the erosion of social cohesion and societal polarization, which we touched upon a little bit before. So when people want to have really polarized views, or they have polarized views because of maybe technology and digitalization, then those can go against each other sometimes if they're not accepting towards other people's ideas. But when it comes to 10 years ahead, it pretty much seems green. So people think that in the long term, environmental change is going to be the number one that is going to have the largest impact on every aspect of our lives. And of course, that is not to say that that's the only important thing, because there might be other changes, other crises that are happening at the same time, but at least that's the perception. And it is bad. So all these articles are actually from the last 2 months. I didn't have to search a lot, and they're all over the world. So starting from India having a heat wave to US states, Greece, Morocco, and generally just planet Earth. And at least how I see it, there are more and more news like this coming, that there are records breaking all the time. And this can maybe also push tourists towards alternative destinations or alternative ways of thinking about tourism rather than the beach and the margarita. So perhaps it's good for Northern Europe. Maybe less people would come actually to Portugal, but it also depends, of course, how this specific region is affected and how it's managed and what is the reason why people come. Because if it's beaches and margarita, maybe that's not going to be that attractive. But if it's for culture, if it's for the food, for other experiences, maybe that could actually attract them here. But we do have to keep in mind these changes, and this is only going to get worse in the coming years. And while we focus on climate change, of course, there is a lot of things in the background. And if in 10 years, the only issue kind of that we have is the environment, maybe we can all just collect forces and focus on that. But what happens if there is still a cost of living crisis, if there are some other economic issues that arise, if there is still a war and other urgent problems that we feel like we have to solve before we focus on the environment? So those are always questions to keep in mind, that it's not just about the environment, but of course it's also difficult to focus on that when everything else comes first. And jumping back to the whole cost of living crisis, actually, as far as I can see, Gen Z actually started to change their spending behavior as well because of the cost of living crisis. And they are actually more concerned, and that's why they are a little bit more careful on what they spend money on. But based on the numbers, of course, we can see one of the things they spend money on is traveling. And now, as far as I could look into, there's actually a lot of debate about will future generations have less money than previous generations. There are actually articles that say yes and articles that say no, and research. So it's an interesting debate, but many people believe it will be so. And there is a lot of complaints coming from actually younger people that they will maybe not be able to live up to the ideals that their parents had about owning a house, having a car, having X amount of kids. Maybe they don't, maybe they can't afford it, but also they don't want maybe. And one of the things that they would like to do maybe is just enjoying life and experience life in different ways, and traveling could contribute to that. I also found an article that says Gen Zs don't have a lot of money, but they are traveling anyway. And not just that, but they also, social issues matter to them too. Apparently 82% indicating a country's approach to issues like LGBTQ rights affect their decision to visit. So it's not just about traveling, but also how we travel and how our actions on traveling could contribute to local economies. Of course, this could be altered by the information that is out there. So depending on what truth you believe, what kind of impact you believe you would have with certain choices, which can be very different from this person to 2 doors after that, the next person, depending on what they read online. And something that's also interesting to me is that there are actually a lot of people that would like to travel off-grid because they feel like they could actually escape from reality. So that's one of the, like I did on the first picture I showed to you in my travel. And they agree that traveling off-grid would allow them to escape from reality. And millennials kind of lead that movement, but also Generation Z and Generation X. And but at the same time, they want to be able to book it online, the whole thing, and they want to be able to do it quick and conveniently. So there is kind of a discrepancy and this friction between we want to use these technological tools and we do find them useful, but then it also has an impact on us maybe in a more negative way. It's getting more and more spread in the world, and there is active development that everyone can get online over time, possibly. At least the people who were involved in this study, which is from the WHO, so again, a little bit of course biased, but they do feel like they are concerned on the negative influences of social media and on their well-being. And this is why this whole connection between we want to go off-grid, but also we want to have digital experiences is having a friction. I also read somewhere that actually if you asked some younger people if they could go offline, they would, but only if everyone else does it. So they don't want to be left out, but otherwise they would actually prefer it. So it's a difficult thing to handle. But also, and again, we are changing the way in which we have our life phases. It's not just about generations specifically. It's actually quite a simplistic way, of course, of thinking about it. But it's also a little bit about life phases. And life phases used to maybe look like that on the top in the 1950s. So you were a child, then you were young, you become a parent, and then you become older. Now we are living much longer, first and foremost. And these can switch up. And preferences on do you want a kid, don't you want a kid? Also across countries, maybe some countries have more maybe individualistic values on average in society, like Denmark, for example, I would say. There's trust in society, but everyone is accepting towards each other's lifestyles, even if they are very different. But there might be other societies where the importance of family, the importance of community really determines how these life phases look like. And those are very different from country to country, and some of them we don't have as much information on, of course. But that is, of course, to keep in mind that combined the aging population with the life phases and how we change our preferences and how we want to live our lives, that's going to be more and more different across the world. And some of the big uncertainties we also talk about is that this polarization in lifestyles and the way in which we want to live our lives, is it going to get accepted, right? And there's not right or wrong way of living. Maybe some people want to follow that model up there. Maybe some people want to be a bit more free on the life phases that they go through. But are those two people mutually are going to be accepting towards each other? And if not, well, how will that actually impact our collaboration across countries? Also our understanding of different cultures and values when they are so different from our own, perhaps. Yeah, and the very last thing before I will actually ask you to talk a little bit, maybe. There's a lot of ideas behind this slide. It's not about the data necessarily, but it's just the fact that, at least my take on it, because I'm not, of course, from the industry itself, but it's there's so many good things about tourism that could actually play onto many of the societal shifts that we have. As I said, the mental well-being, the impact it has on, the positive impact it has on economies, from people having, of course, jobs, the cultural exchanges, being actually open and tackling this issue about polarization, because the more you travel to places and you understand the local perspectives, the more you also are open to how other people live and what their dreams and hopes and fears are. But on the other hand, of course, we have all the damaging impact as well on which the way in which at least tourism is conducted or it has been conducted historically. And this kind of points at a large issue on how we actually measure progress, how we measure development. And it's a really numbers-based approach, as we talked about it before. And as long as we measure it based on GDP and spending, it's really restrictive, and it doesn't take into account sustainability, which apparently is going to be the biggest problem in 10 years, but also all the other shifts that we could see lying behind in the background that will also create a lot of chaos. And this is a very slow change, and it's not something maybe we individually can affect, but it seems like there is actually, at least among the G20 countries, and this is very Western as well, there is an agreement on that they would actually like to have this shift. So the statement was the way in which a country's economy works should prioritize the health and well-being of people and nature rather than solely focusing on profit and increasing the wealth in the country. And most people would like that. But this is a whole system change. It would be a paradigm shift, and it happens very slowly, even if it happens. But that is also going to determine, of course, the future of many, many industries, but especially tourism, which seems to be affected quite a lot by these changes that we talked about before. All right, but I wrote a very small last exercise for you, just to get you thinking a little bit about alternative futures. I brought 4 different futures for you that structurally a little bit different. So we have A, which is a hyper-connected world. So imagine that in this world you are you have a lot of technological advancements. There is really big efficiency, everything is convenient and seamless, and you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. Our world is more connected than ever. There is high-speed trains, there is, you can reach everyone in the globe by that time, everyone has internet access, etc. And it, of course, fosters innovation as well on a daily basis. Then we have B, it's a bit more gloomy. It's called the era of polycrisis. So here you have a series of pandemics, economic recessions, political instability, environmental damages, and there's a sense of course, fear and security. But this also makes people focus more on their community and turning inwards, of course. And perhaps they are also turning more towards virtual solutions to escape a little bit, of course, from the reality, but because they might not be able to do anything else otherwise due to these economic and social downturns. Then we have, of course, and there is some cooperation there across countries, in B. because of necessity. So you have to kind of do what you can to get out from there. Then you have ecotopia rising. This is there has been a big transformation here. So the environment has actually been more regulated. Technology specifically was targeted to create sustainable solutions, and that was the priority of how we use technology. The society unites about ecological well-being, and it fosters global cooperation and commitment for environmental preservation, but maybe you select who you actually cooperate with depending on what values they have and if it's aligned with your own. While in the last one, it's a locals-only scenario, so we really turned inwards. We try to maybe cooperate with regional partners, but otherwise we really try to focus on community and family and try to understand the beauty of our own countries perhaps, or regions around us, and emphasize local culture. So considering these scenarios, my first question would be, which scenario do you think is the most likely to happen? The background. This was a growth scenario. This was a collapse scenario, surprise, surprise. This was a transformational scenario compared to today. So the difference would basically be, it's a little bit of a continuation of status quo, a little bit of how we measure growth already today, but combined with some of the ideals maybe of what we want, right? And then the last one is a constrained scenario. The very last question is asking you if you would like to move, especially those that didn't choose the same thing for these two questions, how can you ensure that we move towards your preferred scenario compared to the most likely scenario that you chose? And you can think about, of course, what we have to do as a society. You can also give a more individual reflection. Are there some requirements or some things that you can imagine happening? Yes, but then just to finish it up, I have another quote from you. Same article, different person. And I thought she had a very good point. So customers will need to share more of the economic burden of tourism, definitely, when it comes to the impact. But I don't see a future where travelers are forced to make the right decisions. But I do think more options should be given to tourists who are willing to search and buy more sustainable and responsible travel products and services. So again, to say, it's not like you push the whole society in one direction. There will always be frictions. There will always be someone who doesn't like the world in which it works. But if you are willing to give options to the different groups of people, or you're willing to give options for those that actually support this maybe status quo change, then we are getting maybe one step closer, right? Yes, and related to that, if you want to see the article, you can scan this code, because then you can also get access to all the other Farsight articles that are freely available. And if you, of course, would like, then just reach out. I will also tell more about the publications. Yeah.
Is there not just another thing that
I love it.
Slightly worries me in all this debate, is that we're moving to perhaps the ideal form of tourism, and how countries perhaps should adapt their policies to attract a tourist that is this way. But there are millions of people in the world who work in, say, factories or whatever, and they have 2 weeks off a year. Where are they going to go?
If they're lucky.
If they're lucky. And the problem is that it's such a tricky thing. We just did an uncertainty catalog on all these things, and the whole equality or inequality question as well in the world, which I guess is part of that topic. We have economic growth. There is an increasing middle class, and generally the world is doing better. More people have internet, more people have access to education and healthcare, but at the same time, there's economic concentration of wealth, and there is more polarization, and there is, so as I understand, the new wealth that is coming into the society is not getting distributed equally. It's getting more and more skewed towards the rich. And I think there's a very interesting dynamic. I don't have an answer to it, but it's very interesting to keep monitoring, because it's a real two-way street that is going in two completely opposite directions. So yes, the world is getting better, and maybe more people could have access over time for traveling. But if the wealth gets so unequally distributed, and we do not have a transformation of what the status quo is, etc., will we even be able to, of course, reach everyone, right? And are those people be able to travel anywhere at all? So thank you so much for listening and being so active. I have no idea how much time I took, but some people stayed, so that's great. Thank you.
So it's the most Portuguese thing that you can have.
Isn't
It's the
it
pastel de nata.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's the best thing.
If something actually stayed in my mind, that was nata, right?
Pastel de nata.
Yeah, from last time when I was here. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's very nice. Oh wait, I should, do this.